Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Author's Eye with me, your host, Derek M. Cartwright. And this week I've got with me the crime writer, Richard Fuller, and the science fiction writer, Sally Ann Melia. Hello, guys.
Hello, Mark. It's good to be here again, and not in a car park like I was last week. So,
Drunk
um,
somewhere in a gutter.
Hello, it's good to be here too, and still sitting in the same chair as last week, I think, so that's fine.
You have actually left that chair, though, at some point, haven't you?
Yes, yeah.
So come on, Richard, what have you been up to this week in your literary shenanigans?
Literary shenanigans this week. Not as much as I would have liked to have done. Been writing a bit. Had one short story that I've done, and pursued my novel a little bit further that's currently going on. I've got a particularly sticky chapter, which thankfully the Hogsback writers tore to pieces on Monday night, so that I can now reassemble in a much better order. So,
As is their wont.
yes, but it's all done in the best possible taste.
yeah.
Yes. Come on then, Sally, what about yourself then? What have you been up to this week?
Well, very busy outside of writing. Still working on the audiobooks. I think, as I mentioned last week, Lazarus is back from the dead and is submitting chapters, so that's very good. And I did my Amazon ads last night, and I also did all my alpha content for my Amazon pages. So my Amazon pages are looking pretty good at the moment.
Cool.
Yeah.
Just in time for it to have gone down again, was it? Yeah.
What?
It went down, didn't it? Amazon disappeared.
Oh, that must be my artwork that I uploaded to it. So destroyed it.
It can't handle the superior quality, Sally.
That's what it is. Yeah.
No,
It's just blown its socks off.
It can't handle it. No, clearly not.
And just in case anyone's interested, this week I've been concentrating on writing a short story for my Runes and Red Tape storytelling channel.
I'd be suggesting the camera was better.
Yeah. So anyway, so there we are. That's everyone up to date. So this week we're going to be talking about managing effectively twin storylines. Now, we're not talking about a story that has twins in it. We're talking about multiple, more than one storylines happening within the one sort of novel. I thought it might be useful before I turn to you guys just to give a brief definition. So, in essence, it's a twin story which holds two or more plot lines. They run in parallel to each other, and they need to be connected. Now, that could be strongly connected, or it could be more tenuous and faint, but there has to be some way that they are interconnected. And then the other thing I would say is just it needs to be distinguished from a single storyline with multiple points of view. So that was anything to add to that, Richard?
No, not really. I think that summed it up fairly well, Mark. I have written a novel which has got multiple points of view, but a single story running through it, and I can sort of talk about that in a little bit. But I know Sally has written more of the twin story, twin protagonist sort of route. So maybe Sally would like to go first and tell us about her, about how she sees this topic and how it works for her.
I think before, I think I was thinking about a very good example this afternoon because just in case anyone's unclear what we're talking about, one of perhaps the best examples that a lot of people will have read about twin or multiple storylines is, of course, Lord of the Rings. And you have the 9 members of the Fellowship who set off on a quest together, but pretty soon end up on 3 separate quests. And what's quite interesting, the challenge there is that as they are in different parts of the world, to try and keep them connected. So you occasionally see something happening in the distance, and you know that another character is involved in that. Although, talking to be honest, wasn't one for writing artificial links. To be honest, once they set off on their separate stories, they pretty much didn't meet until they got to the end of it, really. Yeah. So I think that was one of the most famous stories that people are familiar with, where you've got stories. So you've got Frodo going up to Mordor. You've got Pippin, who ends up in Isengard, which is the city of city of Gondor, and Merry, who ends up with the Riders of Rohan. So they end up on 3 different stories, which is very exciting. Yeah.
And of course, those 3 stories, whilst they're separate and could be told separately, and in some ways are told separately in the book, they actually all have to work, because if one of those 3 stories failed, then the overall quest to dispose of the ring would fail. So that whilst they're seemingly separate stories, they're actually part of the whole thing, and if they didn't all sort of do what they needed to do, all the 3 separate quests, then the main quest wouldn't succeed, because they're providing distraction to Sauron and his crew, aren't they?
Yes, I'd forgotten that, because of course Pippin saves Faramir because his father would have opened the city up to the bad guys. Merry sort of like manages to chivvy the Riders of Rohan along, and yes, if they hadn't done their bit, then the whole final battle might have been.
Yeah, Aragorn goes and camps outside Mordor and sort of forms a distraction to allow Frodo and Sam to sneak in the back door and get rid of the ring. But
Yeah,
none of
that's the
them
final
really
one.
knew
Yeah.
quite how it was going to work out. So these separate stories, they were just doing their own thing, weren't they?
Yeah.
Do you think that's why it took him 18 years to write it?
Really?
Oh, yeah, it took him an awful long time from his first draft before it ended up getting into a publisher's hands.
I think that also reflects in the story, because if you read the book, you can see that the early parts of the book, which he wrote first and probably took a long time on, are very sort of written around the time of, I think, around the time of the war and maybe just after.
Yeah.
They're sort of harping back to the sort of wordy novels from before the war. There was lots of description and not so much action. And as we get into the 50s and move forward, we started having action films, we started having action books, we had James Bond books coming along. And so he speeded up, and the second parts of the second half of Lord of the Rings, to my mind anyway, is much pacier and much more action in it, and much less descriptive, and better for it in some ways, I think.
Yeah. It is. I think it is inordinately hard. I found I wrote my most recent novel. I had 3 characters go off on 3 separate journeys, and writing the separate journeys is easy. That bit, fine. You just rip off 3 different stories, but actually then weaving them into a whole and making their story sort of touch and cross across and be logical, and was really hard. I really struggled with it, trying to piece together the final novel once I'd actually put the whole thing. But I think it works. I mean, I had thought at one point I would do, this is the thing, how do you present the story? Do you do alternate chapters? Now, a good example of alternate chapters is Gone Girl, which the alternate chapters are the husband who's being accused of murdering his wife, and then the alternate chapters is the wife's diary. And they're telling 2 different stories across 2 different timelines, and they end up eventually in the same place. So that one is fairly straightforward. You look at it after, you think like, oh yes, that was obvious. They were going to do alternate chapters, but that must have been quite hard to write as well. Mine, I realised I couldn't do alternate chapters because it was jumping around too much. So I think I did 2 chapters each character and then moved on, because that seemed to work. But it is hard. Are there any rules, do you think? Has anyone come across any rules for writing dual narratives?
I've got a couple of things to consider when doing this. Firstly, the advice is to look at the chronology. Make sure you map out your chronology. Make sure the timelines and everything else all fits so that you don't start, getting ahead of yourself in some ways that, protagonist A has done something at a certain time, but protagonist B should have been aware of, or it hasn't happened, or whatever. So it's just trying to make sure that. So again, when you're doing it, to map out that chronology. And then the other thing that they're sort of the guides are sort of saying is to examine it, just to make sure that they, generally speaking, and although you can have your stories sort of tenuous, sort of faintly linked, that it works better if there's a strong link. Now, it doesn't mean to say that everything has to be completely intertwined, or they don't get their whatever until the end. But you need to look at what are the differences between the two storylines, and then examine where they need to connect. And to try and make the connection just that little bit stronger, because it works better than something that's a tenuous link, because you need to keep your reader with you. So if a reader starts thinking, "Oh, I don't really get, what's the point of that over there, sort of thing." So again, that was something that I've seen. And then the other one was just to touch on the point that you just made about having separate chapters with the Gone Girl, is to make sure it's clear the transitions between those storylines effectively. So if make it clear, make it obvious, so that the reader isn't sort of saying, am I still talking about Fred or am I talking about Joe, sort of thing.
I mean, quite
Yes,
a common way of achieving that is to head the chapter. You start a new chapter, it'll be headed Joe, and then the next chapter will be headed Fred.
Yeah.
And so you know immediately which character you're with at that point. That's a common, easy way of making it obvious to the reader that you switched it over.
That's what George R.R. Martin does throughout the Game of Thrones series. Every chapter is the name of the character. So yeah, it sort of works. It worked until they got to about book 7. And then it sort of stopped working. We seemed to spend a vast amount of time with characters who, to my mind, were remote cousins who you had very little interest in, and very little time with the. Did you read the Game of Thrones all the way through to the end, Mark?
Me, no,
It is,
no.
it is seriously different to the TV series.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I started watching the TV series and I just didn't get it.
You didn't get it either.
Did not get it at all. But I don't know. I'm not a fan of
epic fantasy.
Yeah, that level of epic fantasy. I like magic realism. I like fantastic sort of. I think partly because I look more towards the absurdist kind of satirical kind of vibe. I like the Mickey taking. I like this, I like something that's a bit lighter. And I just find it. And also, my other thing is, a lot of it didn't it was gratuitous in a way. So, you say, when it makes me sound almost prudish. I don't need to see or visualize or whatever. Someone can turn around and say, yeah, they went off and had a good old bunk up. Say, okay, great, let's move on. Yeah. I don't need someone to go through details. And certainly when it comes to killing people, I think we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago about the levels of evil. I'm quite happy that people can be absolutely horrible, totally evil, and all the rest of it. But I don't need a Lee Child kind of description about how to kill someone in the most painful, slow, or whatever way. And I think sometimes, certainly some epic fantasy tends to just go a little bit too much into it. But that's just a personal thing. I admire the craft of how he writes and puts the stories together.
Yeah. The books didn't really. I mean, the television series obviously said, yay, brothels, right, naked women all over the place.
Yeah. Well.
But in the books, you actually were much more in the head of the brothel owner and the girls, and you didn't actually pay much attention to, obviously what was going on
Yeah.
all around them. You're much more, because the whole story about the storyline for the brothel was that the king had a mistress, and so there was a child who was potentially one of his heirs.
Yeah.
You sure it wasn't a
And
prince in a brothel? Oh no, hang on, that's been done in America, hasn't it, recently?
what?
Prince and young ladies of the night.
There's
Yeah,
a
As
reference
in
there.
Andrew.
Prince Andrew.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think
Allegedly,
allegedly.
Yeah.
please.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Let's not go on to current. So I think I thought Game of Thrones was like a guilty pleasure, and I watched it when it was being serialized.
Yeah.
So I watched it every week, which was really good.
I,
But
I I fall into Mark's camp, unfortunately, that I have never read the book, and I started trying to watch the TV series, and after about 4 or 5 episodes, I just found it wasn't gripping me enough to want to continue. So, and whilst I don't mind seeing sex on television or bloodthirsty acts, some of them did feel a little bit as though they'd been put in, particularly by the TV producers, to keep the audience going. Because
Yeah.
so it just didn't grip me really.
Yeah, there's another, for me, is another one of my favorite epic fantasy writers, a guy called David Eddings, and who's did one? Terry Brooks. Terry Brooks did I think a whole series of Shannara books, and a couple of them were converted or made into a TV series for Apple TV, I think it was, or something like that. So I was like, oh, brilliant. Terry Brooks is, I really enjoyed that when I was a young, I used to read all of his stuff, Elfstones of Shannara, all this sort of stuff. Watched the TV, watched the first episode. I got to the 40th minute of the first episode. All of a sudden, they're all taking a kit off. It's all a big, big old bunker. None of that is in the book. None of it whatsoever is in the book.
yeah, but to see,
Yeah.
this is it.
But
I
that's
don't even
TV, innit?
remember the fact that the story. I mean, the way they opened it on television was fantastic because they had the family of the Starks with the seven members of the family. There was 4 children, the parents, and then the other boy. So there was the big family, and they were stood in the yard waiting for the king to arrive. And the first thing the king says to them is, I need you to come back to court to help me sort out my problems. And what does the guy find when he comes out there? He finds that they're short of money. So for me, this was immediately a family drama, a political drama, and they had some really real life problems that you could identify. The political drama and the finances of trying to keep what was spendthrift medieval court afloat, I found fascinating. That's immediately what got me, and I don't really remember much of the rest. Yeah, and then of course you had the thing about whether or not the family would survive once the father had been beheaded.
I think your
Yeah.
stories, Sir Sally, do reflect that, don't they? That
Yeah.
your stories contain great political intrigues and dramas sweeping across galaxies, but
Yep.
it's still, nevertheless, there's those huge political forces in play as well as the personal dramas of the people involved. So,
I never really realized that, but Amazon has got this new thing on their website now where they provide you with a summary of all the book reviews that you've had. And one thing that I've realized that people say about my books all the time is the world building is very good and it's got political intrigue in it. And I was surprised that that was what people were pulling out from it, because it hadn't struck me that that particularly wasn't what I was writing, but of course that is what I wrote, which is just surprise. Yes, and also I didn't actually set out to write I did set out to write a 2-person narrative, but I didn't really think, oh yes, this is going to have 2 streams of the novel and they've got to intertwine and they've got to reflect each other and they've got to do this. This is the story. I just sat down and write it. I mean, yeah.
I haven't written that. I took a different route in my second novel, where I had three main protagonists all trying to solve a crime.
I remember that one, yes.
And they sort of take, not necessarily absolutely turn about, or chapter and chapter about, but they do sort of have. We do see the three of them doing separate things to try and solve this crime. And in those, so we get the chapter with one of the protagonists he's going to check out something, say, let's say a shop, see if they've got any CCTV that might help. And in the next chapter, one of the other protagonists has gone off to check out something else. And so we see the story evolve through these three characters, but it is the same story. They're all working together, meeting regularly, talking on the phone, passing text messages and so on. So the story evolves through telling, and that is a different thing to the.
And I remember
the twin
your
narrative.
early drafts of that, because there was a couple of things that you can get really wrong when you do this. One, you can have a scene, say like a scene in a supermarket, and you've got three characters and you tell exactly the same scene from three perspectives. That is just wrong and dull.
Absolutely.
Unless they're seeing different things. You have to find different parts of the story for the different characters to see, which builds the story up. And what I got wrong in the early drafts of mine, because from the very get-go there was multiple, is I used to do head hopping. So I'd have multiple characters in one scene. And my version of going from one character to another was literally just changing point of view from paragraph to paragraph, and which is very confusing to the writer. In one of the very early rewrites, I said, right, okay, this is going to be character A in this chapter and character B in this chapter. And I went back and rewrote the entire lot. And then once you get into that discipline, it works a lot better. But also working out, yes, they're both in this scene needs to happen, but I don't need three people to tell the same scene.
Now, when I had chapters in my story where the three main characters came together, I always told it very clearly from one person's point of view. So we only ever saw that scene from one person's point of view, although the other two characters were in it. And then maybe next time the three of them came together, I told that scene from a different character's point of view. But again, it was only ever one person's point of view. So there was no confusion over, as you say, jumping around and head hopping.
Yeah. The other way you can identify who's who, if you're not going to use the person's name, is you can put dates and locations. In fact, that's very common in thrillers, to start a chapter with a date and location.
You can do that. You can also start it with the character's name, something like Tom jumped in his car. That's the opening few words of a new chapter.
Oh, yeah.
And then that immediately tells everybody that we're following Tom at this point, not anybody else. And so the next chapter you might start with Brian does something, or Brian picked up his phone, or anything like that. A little action, a little something, a little speech, but you've immediately told the reader whose point of view you're following, and so they can work it out.
Well, of course, that's the thing with thrillers, is that your thrillers are mostly contemporary. So you can pick up the phone and not really worry about it. But with mine, not only do I change character's point of view, but I tend to change location.
Yeah.
And so therefore I have the opening paragraph, the first 4 lines of every one of my chapters is the character. He's doing something's happening to him, but also laced into it, there's a description and movement. Normally I get my characters moving through the scene so that you can walk, talk, do, and see the surroundings at the same time. And you're walking the reader into the new scene every single time.
You also have to some extent, report the bit of world building you needed for that chapter, because if they've gone to a different planet, or they're somewhere else on the same planet, it's very different scenery, background, weather conditions, all sorts of things could be changing around them. So you have to fill that in.
And it's not automatic either.
No, you need to do it. When I'm writing contemporary stuff, I mean, I merely need to put something like, the main street in Liverpool, or wherever the setting is, and you can immediately plonk your reader into that environment with very few words. They've gone in a pub. They walk through the doors of a pub. Tom opened the pub door. immediately tells the reader exactly where it is and whose point of view you're in very few words, which is
You can get away without English people. And
yeah.
you have to think about your American readers. They might not know what you mean by the pub. How do you do it, Mark? Because you write a lot of fantasy, don't you?
Yeah.
With fantastical backdrops as well, even more so than mine, some of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to what Richard's just outlined there. I try and at, at the start of that particular chapter, I try and lead. So I end a chapter with hopefully some that's going to make the reader want to go to the next chapter.
Yep.
And then the first thing I do is I address that particular question, shall we say, in there, in hopefully in such a way that they are now fixed in a time and a position, and hopefully the right person, the person, the POV I want them to be reading. So as Richard just said, I try and do that in the first sort of chapter. I've got to say, I'm not always sure I get it right, and certainly we've had quite a few comments that are feedback from the Writers Club in terms of particularly my POVs, in the fact that with the third novel that I'm writing at the minute, I'm halfway through. This is the one that I've mainly taken through the writers group. I have got two distinct storylines happening. I didn't plan it. That's not how I set out. But then because I am literally making the thing up as I go along, it sort of evolved that way. And I thought, oh, hang on a minute, I've got a separate storyline here, so I need to focus. And then all of a sudden, I'm getting my POVs mixed up. That's what really then made me realize I had two distinct storylines. So then I had to try and separate them out. So I would say it's one thing I struggle with. It's the first time I'm doing the twin sort of storyline, and it's been a lot more effort to try and make sure that I'm not losing where I am in the story. Does that make any sense? Which is why I was saying about these ideas of having a chronology working. It's not helped with the fact that the third story is happening at the same time as the second novel I finished. Because when I was doing the second novel, I've written this passage in the second novel, and I thought, oh, that's a great idea for a story. There's a whole new story on that, and it needed to happen at the same time. So yeah.
Well, as I said, I really struggled to get mine sorted out, and what you end up doing is you end up drawing charts. I had to draw it down to, because the Heir of Empire takes place over 4 or 5 days, and there's quite a lot of travel involved. They have to travel across a planet, which takes about a day and a half. They have to travel between planets, which I put down. I had them going through Stargate, so that took about 10 hours, I decided. And actually, I decided that some of the space travel had to take that long for purposes of the plot, because I needed them to be there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, so
it's faster than light travel, but it's still time,
It's all right for you guys writing fantasy and sci-fi. You can make these things, you can stretch things to suit. If I've got my characters in the real world doing something, and they want to get from Liverpool to London, it's going to take them as long as it takes to do that. And you can't, you can have them break down on the motorway and add a few hours to the journey, but you can't make it suddenly get there any quicker than you physically can. So I have to be very cognizant of real world.
I can vouch for the fact it takes 6 hours to get to Liverpool and 5 hours to get back, because that's what I did. That's where I've been this weekend. So it's terrible. But anyway, so yes, I get your point.
But then once you've set the rules in your fantasy world or science fiction world, you've got to stick by them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. In my first novel, I had which was a single protagonist, single story, so very not really relevant to this thread. But on the time front, they did get taken he got captured and was taken by boat from the south coast of England all the way to St. Petersburg, so by ship, by sea. So I was having to work out all how that works in time scale, and
I had this with the Tahira the Elemental that novel, because I set it in prehistory.
Yes, that's right. You had ships in that.
So I had
didn't you?
ships in prehistory, some with oars and others powered by just wind. And then I had to
Wind.
do the research about what kind of ships would they have? Because although it's a fantasy story, it's set on Earth, you know. So
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, that's all part of the fun of it, Richard, isn't it?
Oh
it
yeah,
is.
yeah. It's trying to make that plot work without without somebody going,
Yeah.
they couldn't possibly have got from A to B in that
No,
time.
that's right. Yeah.
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 But I do think one thing I'm going to take away from tonight, listening to you two, is that I think I'm going to stick to writing single stories.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I can handle the multiple protagonists provided they're in a single story, but I'm not so sure about trying to have multiple protagonists and multiple stories and trying to keep them all coherent and come together at the right point. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
I will let you know whether I manage to sort mine out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the early reviews I had of Born of Empire, the guy said, "Phew, my God, you landed it." He said, "I thought at one point you were going to
Yeah.
lose it, but you got it. You got it to the end."
Fantastic.
yeah.
Which is
Well,
good.
on that bombshell, that's probably about the right time to
Yeah.
knock this on the head. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
can I just say thank you, Sally, and thank you, Richard, for
It's always a pleasure, Mark. I love being
Yes.
here. And next
Cool.
week I'll be in a hotel in Birmingham, I think.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You do live well, don't you, Sally? Hotel in Birmingham. Yes. Thank you, Mark.